that it's worth giving them £500,000? Was there a site visit?
In the ordinary course of events, Chairman, this type of a situation wouldn't arise, and that's part of the reason why I've asked the internal audit unit to review it and to come back to me with a report. I think in relation to the approach that was taken from the information that's available to me, I think the assessment was based on the fact that the site was purchased in good faith when the project had been included in the programme. Part of the reason for it not proceeding in the short term was because of it emerged that there was an insufficient demand in the area. There is a requirement that the site be held for future social housing development, and as part of the social housing strategy and its implementation in Leitrim, obviously we will be looking to see what scope there may be to actually develop that site as part of that programme.
But isn't that a fact that the site is not suitable? Was that one of the reasons?
No, I think the primary reason was that the demand for social housing in the area wouldn't have justified it. I think the site itself it's certainly not the easiest site to deal with from what I understand. But I think the primary reason was that it was an issue around lack of social housing demand.
Do you look at an unsuitable site? Let's just be honest about it. Anyone looking at it would know it's unsuitable. Did the department actually inspect that site?
I couldn't answer that question for you just at the moment, Chairman, but I expect I should have that in the report when it comes back from the internal audit.
So €500,000 then?
It would have been as part of the initial process in terms of the approval process, to actually get into the approval in principle in the first instance. There would have been an assessment made that the site would have been suitable for the development of a project. So that would have been undertaken.
Where's
before.
The £500,000 now? It's gone.
The £500,000 has been paid over to the voluntary body concerned.
And what's the value of the site now?
There is no up-to-date valuation in relation to the site.
Can we get that?
It's certainly a valuation can certainly be found, but I suppose going back to the land aggregation scheme, the valuation or the public value in sites like this and sites in the land aggregation scheme is not so much their resale value, but the fact that they are an asset available for public housing.
See, what concerns me about this particular site is that it was purchased, it was supported by the department, and it took a television programme to highlight it. And now we're asking the internal auditors to look at it. And again, to my mind, it shows a weakness within the department and within that audit unit that these things happen. And I know that not everything is, you get everything right. None of us do. But €500,000 of taxpayers' money is a substantial amount of money, and I'd love to see the report that you're carrying out on it with up-to-date valuations, etc.
Chairman, I share your concern in relation to any issue that may arise in relation to the use of public money, and as you say, none of us can say that we will always get everything right, and it's just because this would have been an unusual type of project. That's part of the reason why I've asked for this report to be done. So this
site?
It was the voluntary body concerned was the Sue Ryder Foundation.
And do they still own the site?
As I understand it, they do, yes.
So you gave money to the Sue Ryder Foundation, and they purchased the site. Would that be the way it works?
They had actually purchased the site because they anticipated that the project would proceed. It had gotten into the approval in principle stage, and then when it wasn't to proceed and the cost wouldn't have been recovered as part of a project, that was where the issue arose. So the site has been, the value of the site was paid over to them, but with a guarantee on the future use of the site for social housing purposes.
And in part of your audit of what went on, will you tell us in that report, or ask someone from an engineering perspective and a planning perspective, is it suitable for housing?
Yes, absolutely.
Because the type of housing that was being provided there was away from any centre. And from what I saw, on the television programme, it was more suitable. You'd want climbing equipment going into it. What about Moore Abbey, Monasterevin? Voluntary housing programme there.
It's not a project I'm familiar with offhand, Chairman, but if...
Have you had any applications from any organisation there in relation to a Moore Abbey voluntary housing association?
I wouldn't say offhand, Chairman, there'd be a lot of interaction between local authorities and individual bodies that might be going on and might surface to us, but we can certainly, if you can give me the details, I'll certainly check.
That's the name of the project, Moore Abbey, Monasterevin. I asked a parliamentary question on it recently.
Okay.
I'll get you the reference to that.
Okay.
The other one I'm interested in is the transfer of the funding of voluntary housing associations or bodies. What happens when NAMA decide that they have an interest in terms of providing a local authority, say, or fulfilling the gap of, in Kilkenny we have 3,500 people on the housing list, and there's 41 units to become available, and then NAMA have those units. Do NAMA negotiate with the department and then the department give the money to a housing agency, or is it the housing agency that negotiates with NAMA and then comes to you for the funding?
I might just, if you, with your permission, Chairman, I might ask my colleague Lisa just to answer you in relation to the detail of the process, but maybe before she does, I suppose one of the issues that can often arise in relation to NAMA properties is that, if you like, they are properties associated with loans within the NAMA remit, but may have receivership, etc., going on as well. And when you look at the overall numbers of units that would have been initially identified by NAMA as possibly being suitable for social housing, there's about a fifth of those were actually ultimately sort of sold or let by receivers in private transactions. So that can arise as a problem in some cases. But maybe Elisa might just outline the process in terms of our NAMA engagement.
No problem. Basically, in relation to NAMA, we have a steering group in place between NAMA, the housing agency, and the department, which goes through the portfolio of NAMA properties as they arise. As the Secretary-General said, NAMA own the loans in relation to these properties as opposed to the properties themselves. So they often have to, I suppose, talk to receivers that might be in place or developers that still own those properties. As the properties are identified, the first step that's taken is the housing agency contact the local authorities in question to see whether there's a demand for the properties in the first place. If there is, then it enters into the process of identifying, where appropriate, if there's maybe purchase under the leasing scheme, an approved housing body that might be interested or able to purchase those units. I suppose just to say there's a number of different ways that those units can come out of NAMA. Either the local authority, if they have funding available, might be able to purchase them themselves. An approved housing body through the capital assistance scheme might be able to purchase them, or they can come through the leasing scheme, either going through the NAMA special purpose vehicle, where the approved housing body leases them from NAMA's SPV, or purchasing them using the capital advance leasing facility. So there's a number of different strands as to how it can come through. The steering group, I suppose, identifies what's the best way of doing those. How the AHBs come into, the voluntary bodies come into it. If there has already been a voluntary body that has expressed interest in those properties outside of the NAMA process, then we tend to go to them first. If not, there is an objective selection process where we would have a panel of approved housing bodies that would have expressed interest in certain counties. And if an AHB isn't already involved in that project, then the project would be sent out to the panel of AHBs for them to come back to express interest in it.
Is it possible to get a note on that?
Of course, yeah.
With a local spin to it?
In relation to Kilkenny
Yeah.
specifically.
The weir,
The Weir View, yeah, I figured that's the 40, yeah.
as soon as you can. Deputy Costello.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a couple of quick questions, Chairman. In relation to the sites, I didn't see in the documentation the extent of the land bank for Dublin City Council. I wonder, do you have any figures on that?
I don't have figures for Dublin City Council, up-to-date figures at this stage, Deputy, but there is a process going on at the moment between the Housing Agency is coordinating with all local authorities to build that picture nationally. They do have a number of significant sites, and you may have seen in the last few days that there was an advertisement for looking for expressions of interest with a view to the development of 3 sites, I think, wasn't it? 3 sites for mixed housing purposes. But certainly once the audit process that is going on, coordinated by the Housing Agency, is complete, we'll certainly make that information, publish that information, so that there is a clear, up-to-date picture.
And will that include the sites that NAMA has available to it in putting together the picture?
That particular exercise will only focus on the lands that the local authorities themselves own. But we have, if you like, other data sets through which we can actually map where there may be other sites in public ownership, be that through the OPW in terms of the state property register, or indeed with NAMA, so we can actually explore to see are there opportunities for sort of site assembly and delivery of greater projects.
We spoke earlier, Chairman, about the possibility of public-private partnerships. We've had a very sad record of public-private partnerships in the local authority, Dublin City Council, in terms of a 16-acre site in O'Debney Gardens, site in Dominic Street, site in Sean McDermott Street, Croke Villas. The entire major housing development that was envisaged over the last 10 years was to be done by public-private partnerships, and nothing was delivered. I don't expect that we'd be going down that road again, would we?
I suppose when you look back, Deputy, to Herberton, the former Fatima Mansions was probably the only one that really got to fruition. The others, including O'Devany and others, were I suppose at a point of possibly moving on when the world around us changed dramatically in 2008.
Perhaps too many of them were put into one basket.
I was just going to absolutely come to that particular point that you make, well, Deputy. Those that form of PPP, if you want to put it that way, was I suppose fundamentally based on the private partner getting a return from the market housing element. So, that's ultimately why they failed, because the market corrected so massively at that point in time. There is provision in the social housing strategy for a public-private partnership element in the delivery, but I think the crucial thing is going to be that we need to do and explore carefully the different forms that public-private partnerships can take, because, as you say, that experience led us to a number of projects all crashing at the same time, because they were all dependent on a particular type of approach. So we may need to look at things from the most basic of arrangement all the way through to more, I suppose, more fully fledged PPPs, where there's a design, build, finance, operate possible dimension to them.
All from it is that so much engagement is made by the community on the public side of it, and that the entire failure came from the private side. Whereas years and years of engagement, of planning, of meetings and so on, that the community was engaged in with the local authority, all that was delivered, but nothing was delivered by the private sector. So I think a closer scrutiny of any public-private partnership would be very welcome. In relation to NAMA, NAMA will be investing at least 1 billion in the STSZ on the docklines. We have seen what happened in Canary Wharf in London, where it's quite dead after 5 o'clock, after the office hours close. Are we is there a social regeneration element to the scheme that would ensure that the indigenous, the local community there, are not neglected, and that the massive investment in office blocks and residential development that is envisaged would be brought to bear on the development? And I mean, NAMA will be putting about $1 billion. There's expected to be another $1 billion put into it. So we're talking about the last chance for regeneration of that particular area.
I suppose a critical, a critical element in terms of the sort of the vitality of an area like that is around the extent to which it ends up as, or is planned to be, a mixed development, rather than, as you say, a type of a solely office.
NAMA has an economic remit.
Absolutely.
Get back
and
money that was entrusted to it.
I don't have a figure for the number of residential units in the Docklands SDZ, but it is substantial, and it is a critical part of maintaining that sort of life through the day rather than and evening, rather than just a 9 to 5 office based and then people exiting. So I suppose ultimately the development in the SDZ is determined by the SDZ planning scheme, and certainly that is framed on the basis of a mixed development with a very large quantum of residential, as you've outlined. And my understanding is that there is already quite an amount of pre-planning engagement with Dublin City Council with a view to bringing forward development proposals of a mixed variety that will actually see I suppose something beyond just purely office and commercial, in line with what the planning scheme sets out to achieve.
It's much more broad.
Much more broadly, and I suppose that there is indeed.
In that area. To what degree is the department amenable to input that could be included and expand NAMA's rather strict remit of not so much social regeneration, but if you like, economic regeneration, purely returned to the department, because the NAMA legislation is quite restrictive?
Yes, I mean the NAMA has a particular mandate and remit in accordance with its legislation. I suppose the broader community and maybe socio-economic type development factors in the Docklands, reasonable amount of progress has been made in those areas through initiatives that the Docklands Authority, which is now being wound up, would have made.
The Docklands Authority now is pretty much a bum steer, didn't deliver on the promises that it made.
Well, indeed, I mean,
this would be the last opportunity to deliver a vibrant community in that area.
And it was one of the things that the Minister and Government will have to decide in the context of approving the wind-up legislation, which I would expect will happen in the next 4 to 6 weeks. Will be issues around the final financial dividend that will emerge from that project, and the scope. I mean, the social generation. Exactly, and that's that piece in particular that I mean under the legislation there is provision under the wind-up legislation there is provision for I can't remember the title given to it, but certainly a vehicle through which the local community and other interests can be involved in the future regeneration of the area. The issue that government and the Minister and Government will need to consider is, well, how can that be supported financially?
Last point, the voluntary housing sector, we have a particular problem at the present time, which you're very well aware, I'm sure, and the Minister is very well aware, and that is the issue of Father Scully House, which is a voluntary housing development of 99 units. Now, your department invested 17 million in its construction, and it has been lying idle effectively since July of last year. With a housing crisis upon us, first of all, how are you going to protect that taxpayers' investment? And can we have a situation going forward with the voluntary housing sector that they can pretty much do what they like? If they're not happy with the rent, they can prevent people from being housed. It's a perverse situation that applies And do we need to ensure that there's government or departmental appointees on the board of the voluntary housing sector?
Well, firstly, Deputy, I absolutely agree 100% with you in relation to the absolutely undesirable situation to have funded a significant redevelopment just on the corner of almost on the corner of Mountjoy Square, slap bang in the middle of the city. 99 units that need to be put to good housing use. I think the minister is very seized of this issue, and I think in the House this week, I think Minister of State Coffey indicated that if this isn't resolved and resolved quickly, that all of the available options will be taken, or certainly will be explored in order to bring it to a conclusion, because we cannot stand over a situation with that quantum of money having provided a valuable and badly needed asset and it not being utilised. So there's absolute commitment. There are ongoing negotiations. I think there was due to be a further meeting, in fact, today, possibly yesterday, was it, between the parties to try to resolve it. I haven't got an update on it, but it is something that we're keeping a very close eye on. I think there is a more general issue that you have raised in relation to the voluntary housing sector, and we do need to put in place a statutory system for regulation of the approved housing body sector, and there is a commitment in the government legislation programme to do that, and under the social housing strategy it is also committed to, and I think it is by Q2 2016, I think, is it? Yeah, that we will establish a statutory based regulator in order to provide that more robust arrangement for the approved housing body sector.
Can you bring that forward?
We have a very, very extensive legislation programme of, I think, 7 bills that, including the Docklands one that we mentioned earlier, that need to be published between now and June. But it is very much on our radar, and if there's anything we can do to bring it forward, we certainly will.
Can you appoint directors to the board of a voluntary housing agency?
Technically, there's probably no reason to not to, but I think from a sort of a policy and procedural point of view, I'm not sure I'd be entirely happy with. I mean, there's a sort of a triangular relationship between the department, the local authority, and the voluntary body, and I think we've had situations in the past with departmental people on boards of certain kinds where there can be a fuzziness in terms of relationships and reporting, etc., responsibilities. So I think, just purely as an initial reaction, my sense would be to have a statutory regulation system that would ensure that we have a quality sector without, if we can avoid it, getting into the space of having sort of multiple responsibilities.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Chairman, just briefly returning to Irish Water and the question on the land aggregation, then just separately, if you'll indulge me. You spoke about, when I was finishing up last, and to the Chairman, the local government fund subvention of 439 million last year and 399 million this year, and 479 million in 2016. And you weren't able to go beyond that. You said to be a new plan in place. But as you know well, your department and every government department published its expenditure ceilings for 2015 to 2017 on budget day, the 15th of October. And there were expenditure ceilings announced in that document for every government department, including your department. It's not possible. It's not possible because that expenditure ceiling figure for 2017 was put in there without some work having been done in each of the departments to make up that figure. So it's clear that there is an estimate in the department as published for the 2017 figure, which you felt we didn't have. You kind of said we have our figures up to 2016, and they must be there, because if they weren't there, it meant the process was a work of fiction. So I'm not saying that here today. So you gave the impression here, you know, we have a plan in place up to 2016, led the chairman to say, well, no organisation could go anywhere with a plan just to the end of next year when you're talking about hundreds of millions. But it struck me during the conversation, of course you have a plan in place beyond that, but you weren't alluding to it, I'll just put it that way. So you might tell us what figure, just to help us now at this stage, I know it's a bit late, what figure you have penciled in, I know it can change, for the subvention to Irish Water in 2017, that's in the expenditure ceilings, is published by Minister Howlin on Budget Day in middle of last October.
I think the expenditure ceilings that you're referring to Deputy, are the voted expenditure ceilings.
Yeah.
The
Local government.
The local government fund is outside the vote, so I don't think the local government fund or the Irish Water element of that would be reflected in those expenditure ceilings. So what we have in place are, I suppose, three things in play. One, clear determinations for the Irish Water from the CER for the period to the end of 2016. We have some indications from the SER about how they will take forward the following 5-year period in terms of the further efficiencies that they will be expecting to Irish Water to deliver. And in order to prepare for that, we have a business planning process going on in Irish Water, which should be finalised shortly, which will take the profile out to 2021. As part of that exercise, that will involve issues around investment and the sourcing of investment, and it will involve issues around, based on certain assumptions, the ongoing subvention that will have to be provided. So that's why I was mentioning the business plan as an important piece in terms of charting out the period beyond 2016, even ahead of the SER doing the statutory assessment of expenditure process.
Okay, I need your help on this one. You're saying the local government fund is not part of the voted expenditure. I think that's what you said.
In terms of figures
Is it? Is it out of central fund?
No, it's not. A lot of the money in the local government fund comes from motor tax.
Motor tax. So, how are we going to use the money for motor tax to pay for Irish Water?
That's what we've been doing.
Yeah,
That's
sorry.
fine.
Yeah, sorry, my mistake there.
No, it's not your mistake.
Yeah.
You're correct.
Yeah. Just where is that?
No, there was, well, I mean, obviously the accounting officer can give more detail on it, but substantial.
Chairman, you come in on that particular point, and the motor tax money is now going to Irish Water.
You can hear it from the horse's mouth there. It's the accounting officer.
Yeah, okay.
The local government fund, Deputy, is a construct that started in 1999, I think it was, at a time when motor tax was paid into the fund, and it was largely going to be used for the roads programme. And the roads programme was part of our department at that stage, going back however many years ago that was. It has since evolved into a broader fund into which both motor tax and local property tax proceeds now go. The local property tax proceeds are recycled back to local authorities, and the motor tax proceeds dimension is used to fund a range of things, including the subvention to Irish Water and including a payment back to the Exchequer.
Okay, I just say, I'm around here a while, I'd actually missed that bit in the last year and a half, and I've never heard anyone been saying it to me in the street that the motor tax now is to go, your motor tax is going to fund Irish Water.
Well,
that's my mistake. Because
No, Deputy, that's my mistake.
Yeah, okay.
I'd forgotten that local property tax also goes into the local
Right.
government fund.
I think the point that Deputy Fleming is a bit stunned about is the fact that in our constituency clinics and generally through the county council meetings, we would receive criticism about the fact that so much motor tax is paid in a particular county and so on and collected. And now that motor tax, instead of fixing the many problems that are on our county roads and so on, a lot of that motor tax is going to a mix of it with property tax.
When you look back historically, a significant proportion of the motor tax proceeds that went into the local government fund would have been funding the general purpose grant allocations to local authorities, a big chunk of which would have been used to fund water services stuff. So it is a historical construct that I think perhaps has outlived its time, and it is.
I'd say the many thousands of people that walk the streets of Ireland protesting against water charges will not be impressed with that explanation, even though I clearly understand it. But
I'm a bit surprised. Like, it's just a funny outcome that I would have thought. It's not in the vote for environment in the local government fund, and maybe I'll ask Mr. Heffernan, because that's power. Can you tell us then, just on this issue, because we had quite a debate at the committee on the expenditure ceilings 2015 to 2017 in relation to voted expenditure, which is in order. What else is not included in those expenditure ceilings that's somewhere out there? It's not. We know about the central fund. What other funds are out there not included in the voted expenditure like this one?
The expenditure ceilings are basically ceilings on the planned expenditure on the voted supply services. Within the ceilings, there will be a number of different expenditures. Obviously, the composition of that expenditure may change over the period of the medium term, and the ceilings themselves are also subject to review at budget time in light of the performance of the economy and the public finances.
Okay, my question was the expenditure ceilings that were published. I hear now the local government fund is not part of that. But I'm asking you, what other major fund that the state expends was not included in the expenditure ceiling? Because most people would have assumed when we're talking about all the voted expenditure that it would have included all the expenditure going through government departments. As I said, I understand the central fund, which deals with interest on the national debt and payments to the EU, is outside that process. But my question is, other than the local government fund, was it your understanding that the local government fund wasn't part of the expenditure ceilings that were published?
The government fund is not part of the voted supply services.
What other funds?
The receipts that go into the fund are the local property tax now and motor tax, and the payments that go out of the fund, they go to pay for road services under the transport vote, and they also pay for services within local government, including subvention towards Irish Water.
Okay, so my question again, you've explained the bit about the local government fund. What I'm asking is, what other funds out there that the public contributes to by way of taxation were not included in the expenditure ceiling report that people understood kind of cover government expenditure, except for the centre?
There would be a number of other funds
That's what I'm asking.
attaching to votes. I'm not familiar with the detail of them, but for instance, the Social Insurance Fund is a separate fund.
Right.
They will be in the published estimates value.
The National Training Fund is part of the ceiling for the Department of Education, or the vote and the National Training Fund.
So it did come under the expenditure ceiling?
It did come under the ceiling.
Well, that's probably public expenditure. I'll ask. Okay. Can you send a report on to the committee as to what funds and how many millions or billions per annum were not included in the expenditure ceiling? Because
certainly we can explain the relationship of the funds to the ceiling, yes.
yeah, the different funds, because we're asking about one or two here now, but there could be more different. Okay.
It was a point, Deputy, that I raised in relation to the Department of Education and the National Training Fund last year, in that there were movements between the subheads and the fund. And it struck me that if the expenditure limit that's set on the estimate can be got around, or potentially got around, if charges can alternatively be charged to a fund, And what I would like to see is a clear distinction between what are the charges that are appropriate to the vote and the charges that are appropriate to the fund, and not to have things moving from one year to the next.
Okay. Mr. McCarthy, earlier when I asked about... Yeah.
That local government fund is made up of road tax payments.
Local property tax receipts.
Road tax payment to the tune of $1 billion.
Just over $1 billion, I think.
That's in 2013.
In 2013 we're referring
commenting
to.
on.
So the road tax payments up to €1 billion was paid into that local government fund in 2013. And then there was €23 million paid into that local government fund in respect of household charge arrears. Right, that was in 2013.
Yes, yeah.
Now, I presume that it was probably similar in 2014, with maybe more money coming into it in terms of the payment from the Minister for Finance, I think.
2014, the household charge arrears piece would have been washed through at that stage. So it would have been the LPT kicked in 2014.
And the LPT would have been worth how much?
I think the figure in the initial estimate was about...
318 million, is it?
That's for 2013.
That's for
That was
2013.
paid directly into the central fund of the Exchequer. Then from 2014 on, the Minister for Finance will be paying
Pays money back.
pays money back into the local
funds, an
government.
amount
What does he-
equivalent to the local property
How
tax
much does he
collected.
pay into it, say, in 2014?
I think 2014 was 476 million.
476 million. So that's 476 million. 1 billion, and then 476 million. And out of that fund, that local government fund, comes 439 million for the subvention.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yep.
So that's made up of road tax and the LPT element of paid from finance into that.
Yeah, the LPT now in 2015 is sort of recycled independently to local authorities individually, so the other items in effect are funded by motor tax receipts proceeds.
Because it does say in the note here that this fund, the Resource and Local Government Fund, are used mainly to provide local authorities with funding for their day-to-day activities and for the upkeep of regional and local roads.
That would have been the case in 2013.
13.
Yes, yeah.
And I'm just saying the shift in that then in 2014 was the taking of this 439 million of subvention to go to Irish Water, which is incredible. Yeah.
So just... Are we right in saying that that local government fund, just to keep the figures in round figures, that about 1.5 billion went into it, approximately?
Yeah, but
Approximately 1 billion was motor tax, two-thirds of it.
about 1.1 billion.
So it's fair to say two-thirds of the 439 billion that went to Irish Water went from motor tax receipts.
That was all two.
Two-thirds of the fund. So, right, you can as I said, I missed that particular issue, that two-thirds of the money going to Irish Water has actually come from motor tax. Two-thirds of the money going from the local government.
Which would have formerly been part of the general purpose grant to local authorities as part of their funding of...
Yeah, you can understand how people will be... Talk about paying for something on... There's a valid case we paid for the water services through our taxation. Now, we're going to have to pay for the water services through the bills, the water rates. And you're actually telling me we'll also be paying for the water services through our motor tax.
In the meantime, the county councils have starved of money to fill the potholes.
So we've three sources of funds now to paying for Irish. The Irish taxpayer is being asked to pay. Taxation goes for the water services as you have it, the central fund. That's money received from taxation. They're going to get money from motor tax. Two-thirds of that, 250 million of that at least, has come from motor tax. And now and we're also saying to maybe smaller than that is going to come through the water rates, through the bills they'll receive from Irish Water. Like, people understood I had a problem paying on the double for their water services, having paid their taxes and now paying for water rates. But if they actually knew you're going to be paying on the treble, because your motor tax also is going to pay for Irish Water. It's a,
The operating subvention to Irish Water is, in general, it comes out of taxation. The vehicle that is used for it, if you'll pardon the pun, is the local government fund.
Can I ask, would it not have been better for that to come out of the department vote? Well, as opposed to the local government fund, which was motor tax. You see the situation we're in now, that I think people will be surprised to know that up to 300 million of their motor tax has gone to Irish Water on top of everything.
Well, there is one amount coming out of taxation. It is matched in an account here that it comes out of the account into which motor tax goes. So if motor tax was going to the general exchequer, the amount would just come out as a payment through the vote at that stage. But it is still one payment. And then there are user charges, be it through the domestic and the non-domestic sector. Those are the other two components of the overall revenue.
It's just getting more bizarre as time goes on. That's all I can say. Just
to wind up, David.
Yeah, I will. Just very briefly. Two other quick questions. You did say, because the whole purpose of this was to get it off balance sheet, and the procedure dealing with Eurostat and CSO was a separate procedure. You said that out. What does that mean? Who has talked to the CSO on behalf of your department, who was, outsourcing Irish Water? Did your department do it? Did PAR do it? Did the CSO come in? Surely you haven't done it unilaterally without discussions with the CSO. Tell me what has happened and the discussions in relation to satisfying the CSO and Eurostat, because you surely didn't do it in the blind.
No, absolutely not, Deputy. Sorry, maybe I didn't intend to say that. I'm not sure whether I did or not, but it's not the MCT and CSO Eurostat. They're not separate processes. It's CSO and Eurostat, if you like, determine the MCT issue. The way the MCT or the Eurostat process works is that the CSO is the national accounting body for Ireland and has to make a range of returns that feed into the national accounts and the various other things such as the excessive deficit procedure, etc. So the way it works is they need to have enough information to allow them to make a submission to Eurostat. So what we are doing at the moment is engaging with them, providing them with whatever information they need so that they can make their submission, and Eurostat will make their determination.
And obviously they can't do that until you have the value of the assets sorted out, because you can't.
Their core issue, and Maria is leading this issue for it, but their core issue, I think, is around the, from a market cooperation test point of view, is around the operating, the approved costs from the CER and the revenue streams and where they come from the domestic, the non-domestic, and from the public subventions.
When do you expect to have
Just to-
views from the CSO?
Yeah,
on it?
just to clarify, in terms of the CSO, they're looking at, say, revenues and the costs. In terms of the assets, I think it's important to say there's no financial transaction associated with the assets. They're just physically moving from one part of the state asset to another part of the state. Which sorry, in terms of the CSO and the national accounts, that's the way they're reflected. There's no financial transaction. Irish Water aren't buying the assets from local authorities. So it's simply that assets that are owned by local government, which is part of government, are moving to a commercial semi-state, which is owned by government. So in terms of the value of that national asset, the CSO maintains the value within the national accounts. So they don't need to be, revaluations occur in a normal accounts like that. So I think that's important. Because there's no financial transaction, it doesn't impinge on what is being looked at that point of view. The valuation of the assets is more from the accounting point in the local government accounts and the accounting perspective from Irish Water.
Last quick question, because I know it's very late and sorry for taking so long. You've mentioned the conservation grant here a few times. Just give me a quick rundown. Who gets the conservation grant, and those houses that have their own septic tank and private water supply that don't have to pay anything to Irish Water? Do they get the conservation? Like, will this be
The water conservation grant, Deputy, under the legislation will be, I suppose, the first test that, or first hurdle that has to be passed is that you have to make a household has to make a valid response to the Irish Water registration process. And that can include both customers and non-customers, because households have to declare that they're not a customer or a part customer, depending on whether they have a water or wastewater service. So that's the first requirement. Then the Act provides for the making of regulations that will determine any other eligibility issues. Those regulations will have to be made in the coming months and will involve the specifying of a date by which that response to Irish Water will have to have been made, so that the process involving the Department of Social Protection can move on in terms of actually making the payment in September.
Yeah, and the question is, those people who won't be customers of Irish Water and won't have a bill from Irish Water, will they get the full €100 grant?
A valid response to Irish Water indicating yes, saying no, I'm not your customer. Yes, that will be from that point of view, that will satisfy that requirement to get the grant.
Okay, Chairman, we'll leave it.
Just one comment, Mr. Heffernan. Given the sort of financial mystery tour that we've been on in relation to the funding of Irish Water, where the money comes from and how it's accounted for and all the rest of it, and the comments made by your Secretary General, Mr. Watt, that maybe there could be a role in the general accountability of this money through the Public Accounts Committee. He wrote and said something to that effect, and he saw merit in it. I wonder, would you ask him to maybe have a look at that and develop it a little bit more in the light of the conversation that we've had this morning in relation to the various funds that are going into Irish Water? Because if he sees merit in it, there might be a point of that section within your department looking at this to determine how best we might, bring forward a plan to give us an input into it. And secondly, could I ask you and Mr. McCarthy, in relation to the Tipperary Hospital, not going into it now, we had this discussion before, and we've had a reply from your minister, which I felt was unhelpful in resolving any matter. Is it possible that your department, Mr. Heffernan, and Mr. McCarthy would share the background to this issue, the fact that it's still not resolved, and come forward with a plan to protect the work already done at this particular location, which I think is to the tune of, was it 6 million or more, and determine how best you're going to protect that investment and complete the project. It is an issue. It is taxpayers' money, and I think if the departments that have invested in this through taxpayers' money came together, we might find an overall resolution to it. It is not good enough to leave that project there. Could I ask that that would happen?
Certainly, Chairman, I'll certainly get an update in relation to it. From memory, I think one of the issues that there was in relation to this previously was that there were some Garda investigations that were still ongoing that needed to be completed, and that the local authority chief executive would review the situation at that stage. I take your point in relation to absolutely protecting taxpayers' money, Chairman. From memory, I don't have the figures here in front of me. I mean, there's been very, very little, if any, money for that project has come through the vote. I think from memory, the vast bulk of it, I think, was on a FOS scheme. I think, but I'm open to.
No, you're right. The local authority, I think, was involved in some.
They had a very, very small. I mean, I think they rented the property.
But can someone
out.
Please untangle the mess that is there in relation to this spend? That's all I'm asking.
Yeah.
Rather than leave it parked there, and with respect, the Garda investigation can go on, but someone has to stop the deterioration of the property to the extent that there's further losses to the taxpayer. And surely that's not a big ask of your department, Mr. Heffernan, because you look over the other departments. Have a look at how the money was spent, or how much money was spent, and then determine how best you can at least protect what was spent in the interest of the taxpayer. And the project itself, which will be beneficial locally. Like, please don't, not you, but please don't allow the system to turn its back on what has been spent and to allow it there to fester and to rot. That's all I'm asking. I don't want any discussion on it unless you want to say something yourselves, but I just asked that would happen.
Just in relation to the specific project, we can talk to the Secretary General of Environment.
He has just been helpful with this instance. There are others involved as well.
On the wider issue of Deep Air and Irish Water, I think our Secretary General wrote to the committee basically saying that Irish Water was set up as a commercial public company, and for that reason it is outside the remit of the CNAG and is subject to the normal regulatory controls, in this instance, SAR. Where the Secretary General was referencing oversight by this committee, he was basically acknowledging that substantial amounts of public money were going in to Irish Water during the establishment phase, and accepted that it would not be unreasonable for this committee to be looking at those issues on an informal basis. That was essentially the.
I'm asking Mr. Heffernan that he would look at formalising that informal basis. I can't do it here as chairman of the committee because I'm told it's outside the remit and it's in legislation and so on. Mr. Watt sees the merit of it. I think most people looking at this debate this morning would see the merit of it. And I'm simply asking of somebody within the system of management of public funds in this country that the suggestion made by Mr. Watt would be at least developed to the point where it's found unworkable or a certain input can be made, establish what that is, and then let us work on it. Because quite frankly, you know, what we have heard here this morning, and it's none of your fault, it's all in legislation, it's how you do your business and all the rest of it. It's just been, it is difficult to understand and to support the notion of how all of this taxpayers' money from various pots of money gets into Irish Water. And all I'm asking is, would you ask? When you're on a radio programme, whether it's local or national, one of the things that unnerves you a little bit is when the presenter says to you, oh, by the way, I have this text message that's just come in. Now, we're like a radio programme here, or television, whatever, because they text in. And this fella says, oh, I see, he said, they're not potholes anymore. He was talking about the water tax. He pays his road tax. So he says, they're not water holes anymore, they're water reservoirs. Brilliant. So, there you go. For what it's worth. So if you wouldn't mind doing that, and that's not to trivialise the issue, that is a serious issue. The committee then agreed to dispose of Chapter 6, the Land Aggregation Scheme, and Chapter 7, matters arising from audit of Vote 25, Environment, Community, Local Government, in relation to water services.
No way.
Right.
We're waiting for information to come, and not that of any, but I'd like to see the colour of the information before, and then we can sign off in a minute at a future date.
That's agreed. So the committee stands adjourned until Thursday, the 12th of February 2015 at 10 o'clock. Thank you very much.